We are set to begin. So do you want to take it away, Joseph?
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to Harvard Law School, particularly Section 5 of the JD class of 2023, for hosting this conversation today with Professor Noam Chomsky, to whom we are the most grateful for his generous giving of time. Today's event will begin as a conversation between Professor Chomsky and our moderator, Michael Lehavi. We will save some time for audience questions, at which point you may use the raise hand function for Michael to call on you, or you may also privately message Michael your questions at any point during the event. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, Joseph. I want to reiterate Joseph's thanks to Professor Chomsky for generously donating his time to us. I want to thank Joseph Jung for organizing this along with Section 5 and the Section 5 committee. For advisement and preparation for the talk, I want to thank HLS professors Richard Lazarus and Kenneth Mack, as well as professors and faculty elsewhere, Christiane Leon, William Ramsey, James Woodbridge, Jesse Fitz, Yasmin Ozel, Neil Sinabubu, and Greg Jansen. It's impossible to provide an adequate introduction for Professor Noam Chomsky. He is the Institute Professor and Professor of Linguistics Emeritus at MIT and Laureate Professor of Linguistics, as well as Agnes Nelm's Oury Chair at ASU. The word profound is simply insufficient. He is the most quoted author alive today. By 40, he revolutionized linguistics and is widely recognized as the most important linguist to have ever lived. He is the preeminent champion of rationalism, an originator of contemporary cognitive science, an essential figure in analytic philosophy. Alongside incredible contributions to the sciences and humanities, Professor Chomsky has been a lifelong activist and incredibly is perhaps better known for his activism than his groundbreaking contributions to the sciences. A running joke that captures a fraction of the esteem people hold for Professor Chomsky is that he is one of 5 to have ever read Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead's Principia Mathematica cover to cover. Professor Chomsky, thank you for being here with us.
Glad to be with you.
So to start this off, earlier this year, you admitted while engaged in discussions of the sort we're having now, a part of your mind is occupied by problems that are more intellectually stimulating. To provide those in the audience less familiar with your technical work some sense of it, what are those problems?
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part. Could you say it again?
To provide those in the audience less familiar with your technical work some sense of it,
oh, that
what
would
are those
take
problems?
a couple hours to describe, but you just took me from it in the middle of a long article on new technical work to try to extend what's called the minimalist program, which is an effort to provide genuine explanations for linguistic phenomena by reducing them to elements so elementary that they satisfy conditions of evolvability and learnability, which are very narrow and strict empirical conditions. So it's basically trying to show that, to put it kind of fancifully, that Mother Nature designed language as a perfect system for expression of thought. Not very good for communication. That was not a consideration, but it's very well designed for expression of thought. And it may, in fact, constitute thought, traditional view, which is not implausible. Which, if correct, means that people like you are the only organisms with thought in the entire history of life and maybe in the entire universe.
Okay, thank you for that. Given our abundance of time, I thought I'd ease into the social issues. We're in a period of brinksmanship, socially, environmentally, and militarily. Do you see hope for the world today?
Well, the hope for the world actually lies in the hands of people like you. We happen to be in a very unusual moment of history, in fact, unique moment of history. We're in the midst of a confluence of crises of a kind that have never occurred before, and unless they are solved, will never occur again, because unless they are dealt with quickly and effectively, there will be no further human history. This may be coming to a close. The crucial point is with every one of these crises, environmental catastrophe, increasing threat of nuclear war, severe deterioration of democratic functioning in democratic societies or quasi-democratic societies, pandemics, probably other ones coming. For all of these problems and many others, there are solutions, and we know the solutions, and they're feasible, but it's not enough to have knowledge. You have to put it into effect. And unless that's done, and done pretty quickly, we're basically toast.
You have an acute awareness of the grave problems we face today and of our failures to address those problems. That notwithstanding, you constantly express levels of optimism regarding humanity's capacity to correct course. That course for correction requires recognition of the dire problems we face. Are you at all concerned that in a war between bullshit and the technical Frankfurt sense espoused by the self-interested and reason, bullshit will win out?
Again, I didn't hear the last part. Can you say the last part again?
Are you at all concerned that in a battle between bullshit in the technical Frankfurt sense and reason, bullshit will win the day?
It's the same story. The question is in your hands. There's no way of predicting. These are matters of choice. You can succumb to it. You can struggle against it. And the outcome of that, there's never any way of predicting. But the point is, we have the means to overcome these destructive tendencies. And then comes the question, are you willing to engage in ensuring that those means are implemented expeditiously in a way which will lead to prospects for continuing the human experiment instead of terminating it. And again, I think it's worth stressing that you are, in fact, the first generation in human history who has ever had to face this question. And you're also probably the last, because if it isn't solved in your lifetimes, the future is extremely dim.
In Manufacturing Consent, you explained how elites use mass media to get the public to embrace bad leadership and disastrous foreign policy. Today, it seems that certain elites are using similar tools to manufacture dissent. That is, create illegitimate distrust and hostility toward those very same power sources, for example, intelligence sources that you warned us about. Have we come full circle from abusing media to create too much trust in institutions to abusing media to create too much distrust in institutions? And what do you make of that?
Well, actually, distrust in institutions is very deep, goes back very far, often justified. It's been exacerbated by what's been happening in the past 40 years. I remember that we have had 40 years of a neoliberal assault on the general population, began in the late 70s, escalated with Reagan and Thatcher, thanks to US British influence, pretty much spread around the world. That's had very definite effects. One of the effects, well, just to be concrete, there was a recent study by the Rand Corporation trying to estimate how much wealth was transferred from working people in the middle class, in their measure, the lower 90% of the population, how much wealth was transferred by them to extreme wealth during the past 40 years. their estimate is about $50 trillion. And that shows up in people's lives. You can take a look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics figures on, say, manufacturing. You find that until 1979, manufacturing employment increased. From 1979 till the present, it's declined, particularly after the impact of the so-called free trade agreements, which have very little to do with free trade or even trade, but are investor rights agreements, which are designed to set working people in competition with one another around the world. Well, investment is protected by highly protectionist laws that were never existed before. And of course, that has an effect, an obvious effect. So by now, 0.1% of the population have doubled their share of the country's wealth since 1980, from 10% to 20%. For much of the population, large majority, it's been stagnation, decline. It's gotten so extreme in the United States that we now have a decline in life expectancy, which is unheard of in developed societies, except in the case of war or pestilence, deaths of despair, as economists call them, people in the mostly white working class who've just given up. They're not in the statistics. They just die. There's nothing for them. Well, all of this has led to, not just in the United States, many other Europe, elsewhere, to a lot of natural resentment, anger, contempt for institutions. Throughout the Western world, the centrist political parties have significantly declined. It's happened here too. Here they keep the names. In Europe, they change names. But pretty similar around much of the world. And one aspect of this is that this ressentiment, as Nietzsche called it, just anger, unfocused resentment, is a perfect terrain for demagogues. They can come and say, I'm your savior, trust me, follow me. Meanwhile, stabbing you in the back. That's what we've been living with for the next 4 years, and we'll probably live with for the coming 4 years, no matter who happens to be in the Oval Office. President Trump is, in my view, the worst criminal in human history, just because of his climate policies. There's plenty more to talk about, but there's no way to get rid of him. He has succeeded brilliantly in tapping poisonous currents that lie right below the surface in American life, bringing them out to the surface. They fit the atmosphere of resentment and anger. And he has also tapped currents that are real in a very destructive way, but he's done it successfully. People who realize that the policies that have been pursued in the last 40 years are destroying them. Rural America is being devastated. Working class areas are undermined seriously. That's all real. And Trump has been able to stand up and say, I'm your savior, while at the same time doing everything imaginable to harm them and destroy them. Managed to carry off both things, very, in a way, brilliant confidence and performance, but with some basis in reality. Have to face that. The political opposition offered no alternative. The Democratic Party has simply pretty much abandoned the working class in the 1970s. The last shot of any indication of support for working people was the Humphrey Hawkins Full Employment Act in 1978, which Carter didn't veto, but he watered it down so that it was essentially meaningless, just words. And since then, the Democrats have just followed along with the war against the working class and much of the middle class. Obama was an interesting case. You can read his memoirs now, which give a very prettified picture of what happened. But what actually happened, and people, working people in Massachusetts, grasped it very quickly. I was living in Massachusetts then. Obama at once betrayed working people instantly. He was elected in 2008, lots of enthusiasm. Wonderful person has come. We can put our faith in him. Working people voted for him. We're going to have change. It'll all be great. First thing he did was stab him in the back. He had Congress. Remember, both the Senate and the House were Democrat run. Within 2 years, he had created the basis for Trump. Very straightforwardly. The country was in that time, as you recall, or at your age have heard, there was the housing bubble had collapsed. It brought with it a financial crisis. Began under the second Bush, but was raging when Obama took over. He took over the Bush programs, the TARP program, which had two elements. One of it was bail out the criminals who created the crisis, the banks who had carried out predatory lending, subprime mortgages, complex financial instruments, derivatives to make sure nobody knew who owned what. Building up a huge bubble, collapsed, was their crime. They have to be bailed out. That part was taken for granted. So they were all adequately compensated for their crimes. There was another part to the TARP legislation. Do something for the people for their victims, the people whose homes were foreclosed, whose lives were destroyed. Do something for them. That was never implemented. And the other memoirs that are beginning to come out indicate that it was apparently just ridiculed in the few discussions about it. But without knowing what was going on in the White House, the working people could see what was happening. In Massachusetts in 2010, there was a by-election to replace Ted Kennedy, who had just died. It was won by a Republican, Scott Brown, unknown Republican. If you look at the voting statistics, lots of union workers either didn't bother voting or voted Republican. They had just seen what had happened. Okay, it's not really the case that Trump picked up the working class. The Democrats gave it away. They lost it, and they haven't done anything since to change that. So that's the kind of situation we're in. Yes, plenty of anger, plenty of contempt for institutions, has a basis in 40 years of policy. It came as no surprise. You go back to 1980, it was perfectly evident what was going to happen. Just think about it for a minute. Ronald Reagan came in, and the lines he was told to read in his inaugural address said, "Government is the problem, not the solution." Well, there are decisions made at a national level. If they're not made by government, they don't go away. They're made by someone else. Yes, they're transferred into the hands of private power, unaccountable private concentrations of power, corporate sector. That's where the decisions go. And they received instructions from the economic guru of the neoliberal movement. Milton Friedman wrote a famous article in 1981, I think it was, and a very influential article in which he explained that the responsibility of a corporation is solely self-enrichment, no responsibility to stakeholders. The taxpayer, the public, grants corporations special rights. That's why people incorporate instead of being a partnership. They're granted special rights by the public, but according to the Friedman neoliberal doctrine, they have no responsibilities. All right, just put it together. Decisions are taken from the public domain, put into private hands. The sole responsibility of those private hands is to enrich themselves. Does it take a genius to predict what's going to happen? Hardly. Now we see the effects of it after 40 years. I should say that this 47 to be precise, $47 trillion giveaway to the wealthy from the general population is a vast understatement. If you look more closely, you'll see that the Reaganites quickly changed many administrative procedures, even laws, which opened the spigots to massive robbery. Tax havens, shell companies were all illegal up to 1980. And the Treasury Department enforced the laws. It was really working. The IRS existed. They enforced the laws. Reagan opened it. It's all open. What does that mean? Well, it means, for example, that the world's biggest corporation, Apple, doesn't have to bother paying taxes. They have an office in Ireland somewhere, which is probably about the size of the room I'm talking in, which secretary may show up every once in a while to shuffle some papers, but they're an Irish corporation, so they don't have to pay taxes, thanks to Ronald Reagan. That's sheer robbery of the public, and it's at the level of tens of trillions of dollars. Nobody can really estimate it because the only evidence comes basically from leaks like the Panama Papers. Congress could investigate, but in order to investigate, they have to want to, and they're on the same payroll, so they don't want to investigate. There's nothing like, say, the Church Committee or anything like that anymore. In fact, Congress doesn't even want to know simple data about what's happening in the world. Congress had an Office of Technology Assessment, which provided independent scientific analysis on major issues, like NAFTA, for example, to which they were very strongly opposed for good reasons that they developed. Congress just dismantled them. That was the 1990s. It's not Trump. Trump, of course, has tried to throw all science out of the government, but has deeper roots. So there are plenty of issues. And that's in the background to your question. It doesn't come out of nowhere. Yes, there is contempt for institutions, and with pretty good reason.
Thank you for that brilliant explanation of the structural problems we face today. Moving from problems to solutions for a better tomorrow, you've said in several interviews that responsibility to society is a function of opportunity. More opportunity equals more responsibility. This Zoom is filled with people that have tremendous opportunity, but also face a series of perverse incentives that distract and dissuade from accepting social responsibility. How do you suggest people in this Zoom call and those similarly situated navigate that landscape?
That's nothing new. There have always been powerful incentives to be a successful criminal, an exploiter, a slave owner, an aggressor who can steal other people's resources. You can gain a lot that way. And what's more, you get into positions of power. But there also have been people who said, we don't want that. We care about the common good. We care about other people. We're going to work for them, okay? And there's a struggle all through history that shows that conflict in one way or another. So go back to some of our oldest records, or say the Bible. You go back to the Bible, there was a class of people called prophets. You read about them in Sunday school, and you say, how nice. But if you think about it, the prophets were kind of what we would now call dissident intellectuals. They were people condemning the crimes of the evil kings, warning about, giving geopolitical analysis, warning about what their policies would lead to, the destructive policies, calling for mercy for widows and orphans. It's basically the message of the prophets. Not entirely, but the core message. How are they treated? Put in prison, driven into the desert, condemned, ridiculed. There were also people called, who were centuries later, were called false prophets, the flatterers at the court. Now, they were doing fine. You go back many centuries later, the values are reversed. You honor the prophets and condemn the false prophets. But that pattern persists through history, right until today. Today we have different terms for it. The false prophets are called themselves technocratic and meritocratic intellectuals, or some name like that. They're the ones who, as Kissinger once put it, articulate the views and ideas of people with power. They're doing fine. There are also critics and dissidents. They're not doing so fine. Depends on the society, but in one way or another, almost every society has some way of either marginalizing them or just killing them, or imprisoning and torturing them. Okay, that's pretty natural. That's what you'd expect on the basis of the incentive structures you describe. We see it all through history. So for example, take the term intellectual gained its modern usage in the late 19th century at the Dreyfus trial in France. The Dreyfusards were the first ones who were called intellectuals in the modern sense. Emile Zola, most famous, and others. Today, we respect and honor the Dreyfusards. Not in their day. They were bitterly attacked. Emile Zola had to flee for his life, had to flee from France to England. The immortals, the Académie Française, the major intellectual power center, bitterly denounced the Dreyfusards as people who were daring to criticize our wonderful institutions, the courts, the army, and so on. They were what in 1968, former Harvard Dean George Bundy called wild men in the wings. He had been the Johnson Kennedy National Security Advisor, wrote an important article in Foreign Affairs in 1968. That's the peak of the peace movement, in which he distinguished responsible, serious intellectuals who may criticize our tactics, but don't go beyond that. And then there are the wild men in the wings, me, for example, who were daring to criticize the policies, at what they were aimed at, and the motives, and look at the internal documents and see what they were planning. Those are wild men in the wings, just as all through history. You can see the same things today. Okay, So how about you? You can take your choice. You can be a wild man in the wings, work for the common good, or you can accept the incentives, become a rich corporate lawyer. Okay, you got the choice.
Thank you for that. Moving on, and I want to remind the audience to begin raising their hands for the Q&A session that's coming up shortly. But moving on, as it pertains to political matters and matters of scientific import, what do you view as the correct degree of epistemic humility? And are you at all concerned that irrational epistemic confidence that stems from ignorance of fallibility advantage the unreasonable in terms of persuasion or effective rhetoric, which I know are not your favorite ways to think about the issues of the world? But
I think in principle, we all agree on the answer. We should have reasoned deliberation, attention to evidence, rational discourse, recognition of the legitimacy of disagreement, working together to try to overcome it. That's pretty much the case of the sciences, especially the hard sciences. Not perfect by any means. You can find serious flaws, but it's basically the guiding ethics, the guiding ethic of the sciences. When there are deviations from it, they're criticized. They persist. You can find cases of scientific malfeasance, falsification of experiments, unfair criticism, so on. But it's, by and large, it's the margins. The basic thrust of the main sciences is you got to pay attention to evidence and rational argument. And in the sciences, you can't get away for very long with not doing that, or you'll be exposed. Well, as you move to other disciplines, the rigor, the discipline that's imposed by the facts of the world is lessened. We understand less. Power interests have a greater effect. So you get more of what you've just been describing. But there's no reason to accept it. We should insist on it. And it's a very live issue. Take right now. Let's take the least of the major crises that we face. There are many. The least of them is the pandemic. We will emerge from the pandemic at terrible cost, needless cost, as we can see from the examples of countries that have paid attention, had some concern for their own populations, and overcame it, and sometimes in pretty amazing ways all around the world. There are some who totally failed, like the United States, one of the worst. But it's not from not knowing what to do. You knew what to do, some followed it, some didn't. If we look at what happened in the United States, it's very instructive, and it's important for the future. When we finally overcome the pandemic, we will be facing a situation very much like 2003. In 2003, there was a major coronavirus epidemic, SARS epidemic. It was contained. Scientists at once pointed out there are going to be other coronavirus epidemics, could be more serious than this one. Here's what you have to do to deal with it, to get ready for it. Okay? They're saying the same thing today. They're saying when we get out of this one, there are others coming, very likely to be worse. Here's what you have to do to get out of it. Same instructions. Well, what happened in 2003? The knowledge was basically there. The ideas about what to do are there, but somebody has to pick up the ball and run with it. Who will it be? Same questions are arising now. It could be the major drug companies. They have huge laboratories, wonderful resources, profit coming out of their ears, thanks to the highly protectionist anti-free trade agreements. Everything ready except one thing: capitalist logic. Capitalist logic says you don't waste money on something you might make a little profit from 10 years from now, even though it might save the population for destruction. That's not capitalist logic. Capitalist logic is make profit tomorrow, okay? So the drug companies were out, they didn't do anything. There's the government. Government has great laboratories. That actually, most of the basic research that's done for vaccines and drugs is done in the public sector anyway. We have laws which require that though the basic research and the risky steps are taken at public expense, the public is not allowed to share in the profits. Once the work is done, you hand it over to private tyrannies. They do the marketing and make the profit. And of course, fix up the products a little bit. That works in every domain. Your computer, for example, or drugs, but including, say, the Moderna drug, the vaccine. Basic research all came out of government-sponsored work, but they're not going to. You're not. People are not going to make the profit from that. The executives of Moderna will. That's our social and political system. Well, the government could have stepped in, but there's a barrier to that too. It's called neoliberalism. Government is the problem, not the solution. So the government didn't step in. So therefore, basically, nobody picked up the ball. Well, there were things that you could do when Obama came into office, 2009. First thing he did was call a meeting of the Presidential Scientific Advisory Council. And he asked them to prepare a pandemic response program. They came back in a couple of weeks and it was implemented. The Obama administration did implement the program. There were also programs of American scientists working in China to try to identify potential coronaviruses, find out about their characteristics, get ready in case one of them crosses from animal to human, leads to an epidemic. Now that went on through the Obama years until January 2017. President Trump was elected. First thing he did, first days in office, was dismantle the pandemic response program. Totally. Next couple of years, moved to kill the programs with American scientists working in China, get rid of them. Next step, actually from the beginning, defund the Center for Disease Control, and in fact, all health-related aspects of government. That went on year after year, every budget. Congress sometimes overrode it, but the budget from the White House is defund, and destroy everything that might protect the population. The last time this happened was February 2020. Pandemic is already raging. Trump's budget says defund the Center for Disease Control and other health-related elements of government. We'll probably find the same thing next February. As you know, of course, the administration has not conceded the election. They're acting as if they will be the next administration. And one of the things they're planning to do is, they have said, is come out with a budget for next year. Probably more of the same. Okay, well, different countries reacted. Then, of course, once the pandemic struck, countries just reacted differently. Some of them, like countries of East Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Oceania, New Zealand, Australia, Africa, which did quite a good job. They moved very quickly to try to contain it. One of the most amazing cases is Vietnam, a very poor country, right on border of South China, center of the epidemic, had no cases for a couple of months, half a dozen, a handful now from visitors. Even countries like Senegal, Kenya, others managed. Europe sort of dithered. Not great, but they finally sort of got their act more or less together. There's a few countries that are just off the spectrum. The United States is one of them, one disaster after another. By now, the government has said, we've just given up. We can't control it. It's in the hands of states, localities. So, and my own frank suspicion is that the lame duck administration is perfectly happy with this. If the country becomes really ungovernable and in a rotten state, they're in good shape. If Biden takes office, he'll have plenty of problems. This will make it worse. The inevitable failures can be blamed on the new administration. The other administration in Mar-a-Lago, which will have Mitch McConnell's Senate in its pocket, and will call themselves the real government, not the fake government. They can exploit all this, come roaring back in 2024. I think that's what's being planned. And it'll be with the help of the legal profession, which is one of McConnell's only, the Senate used to be a deliberative body. You look at recent years, it's not a deliberative body. It doesn't take proposals from the House and try to work on them. It does two things. One, pass laws that'll enrich the super rich and hit everyone else in the head, like the tax scam, 2017. The other is staff the judiciary, top to bottom, with young, ultra-right lawyers who'll be able to block anything for a generation. So no matter what the public wants, these ultra-reactionary policies can persist. That seems to be the plan that's developing. Well, you don't have to accept it. But going back to the pandemic again, we have the same choices now. Very likely there are other pandemics coming. So far, we've been lucky. Every coronavirus epidemic has either been highly contagious and not too lethal, like the current one, or highly lethal, but not too contagious, like Ebola. Who says the next one is going to be that lucky? Maybe it'll be both. Plus, it'll all be exacerbated by global warming and habitat destruction. So we can anticipate a much more serious pandemic. And we can do something about it. We can take the advice that was there in 2003. That means we have to overcome capitalist logic, the neoliberal assault, and the malevolence of government figures. That's the three problems. Can all be done. It's not going to happen unless people do it.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. Transitioning now to audience Q&A, I'm going to call Anna Bittinger. You should be able to unmute.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for talking to us. Moving back to the subject of the first question, as somebody who fell in love with linguistics in college, really in large part to do with your work, I would just love to hear why you chose to study linguistics in the first place, and then what keeps you studying it.
I'm sorry, I couldn't catch it. Could you repeat, Michael?
I believe Anna said that she studied linguistics and fell in love with it, and fell in love with it through your work. And she was
Congratulations.
she was wondering why you fell in love with linguistics to start.
Why I personally?
Yes.
Well, I'm interested in human beings. Let's go back to the first thing I said. There's some pretty amazing things about human beings. And almost all of them derive from the fact that we have language. One amazing thing is that we have thoughts. I mean, I have two lovable canines. I can't use the word, or there'll be a rush to the door under my desk. They don't have thoughts, and they have things in mind, like half a dozen of them. And but they don't have anything like thoughts in the sense that humans do, that can be articulated as beliefs, arguments, expectations, plans, and so on. That's just not there. And the same is true of every organism that we know, including our closest relatives, the great apes. Even with very intensive efforts at training, they can't pick up the basic, most elementary rudiments of language. It's not because of any sensory motor deprivation, same as us, but they just don't have whatever's inside. So in fact, there have been, in the roughly 4 billion years of life on Earth, there have been about 50 billion species. There's one that can have thoughts, and those thoughts are based on the fact that we have this amazing capacity for language. As I said before, this might be the only one in the universe. The grand old man of American biology, Harvard biologist Ernst Mayr, once pointed out that if you look at the one example we have, life on Earth, turns out that the successful species, the ones that are biologically successful, that proliferate and survive, are pretty much the dumb ones. Bacteria, insects, beetles, they do fine. As you move up the scale of what we call intelligence, there's fewer and fewer of them, and they don't last very long. In fact, up until very recently, there weren't very many humans. It's only roughly the last 10,000 years. Well, there's this one species, and he suggests that he says there's plenty of planets all over the universe. There is something which you may have heard called Fermi's paradox. The great physicist Fermi, who's wondered why, with all of the huge numbers of planets in the universe that are very much like ours, how come we can't find any signs of intelligent life? And Mayer's suggestion is there isn't any. It's better to be stupid than smart, basically. The chances of higher intelligence developing are slight, and if it does develop, it may be a lethal mutation. He didn't go on to say it, but now I'll add something. We're in the midst of trying to show that it is a lethal mutation. We're in the midst of acting in ways which will destroy life on Earth, and are already doing it in a massive scale with the sixth extinction. Anyhow, all of these unique properties, maybe alone in the history of the universe, are based on the existence of language. So I think it's a fascinating thing to study if you want to understand not only humans, but something about the nature of the universe. Anyway,
Thank you for that, Professor Chomsky. That was fantastic. Moving to our next question, Andrew Santana, you should now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Hello, Professor Chomsky. Thank you so much for your time. My question is, how do we overcome the algorithms that dictate our public discourse when those algorithms have been designed with capitalist logic? How do we break the vicious cycle to achieve rational, democratic discourse?
very simple. By doing it, don't be overwhelmed by the algorithms. Sounds fancy and scientific, but it's just sharpening ways of control and domination that have existed through the ages. And it's not making that much of a change. And you resist it the way you always did. And in societies that are really harsh and brutal, it's a rough go. If you're living in China, let's say, or Saudi Arabia, or Iran, it's not easy to get up and say, I'm going to challenge existing authority. Some do it, like Ai Weiwei in China, others, but not very easy. If you're living in a society like ours, it's not that hard. I mean, if you're like us, privileged, all of us, then you're pretty well protected. I mean, you're not going to be shot, you're not going to be tortured. Maybe you'll be called a wild man in the wings. Maybe you won't be able to get the job you want. And maybe you'll be excluded from national public radio, as I am, for example. But, that's not the end of the world. There's a lot of things you can do, and there's a lot of gratification in doing them. So for privileged people like us, plenty of opportunities. You don't get the amenities that you will get if you join the persecuting class any more than throughout history. But that doesn't mean you can't do it. So I'd say forget the algorithms, forget the repression, just move ahead.
Thank you. I just want to confirm that is 3 a hard stop for you, Professor Chomsky? There's many people that are interested in asking questions. I just want to make sure in terms of these last few minutes how to use the time. Is 3 a hard stop? Professor Chomsky?
Yeah, that's fine. Let's go on.
Is it okay? Okay. Kevin Vasquez.
Thanks, Michael. And hi, Professor Chomsky. First, I just wanted to say I'm a huge admirer of your work. I've read dozens of your books, and they've totally transformed the way I look at the world. And so it's really an honor to meet you and to listen to you. But my question is something that I struggle with a lot and that I talk to a lot with people. And it's sort of basic, but this year and for the last half decade at least, we've seen these huge movements for racial justice popping up and developing. And I think a lot of times these movements are divorced. They're about representation, and they're divorced from critiques of corporate power or capitalism or inequality or poverty or so many of the other things that you've talked about today. And for that reason, it seems to me like they're almost acceptable to the neoliberal power structure because they're about basically maybe changing who's in the corporate boardroom, but not changing the fact that the corporate boardroom exists. So my question to you is, to what extent do you think these movements about racial injustice are helpful to us on the left? And to what extent do you think we need a class-based, broad politics that talks about economic issues, corporate power, and political corruption and things that appeal to working class people of all different races?
So let's take the major social movement that's just emerged, Black Lives Matter, okay? It's a very striking development. We learn a lot from it. There was a lot of organizing that went on for years, laid the background for what happened after the Floyd murder. Didn't just come out of nowhere. But there was an amazing development right after the Floyd murder. Within days, the biggest social movement in American history emerged. A huge social movement, lots of participation, Black-white solidarity, enormous public support. Unprecedented public support was about 2/3 support. That's way higher than what Martin Luther King received at the peak of his popularity. And wasn't just here, it was elsewhere too. Well, that's came out of a background of activism and organizing. Then comes the aftermath. What tactics do you use? Okay, that makes a big difference. Big difference. Let's take the slogans that came out of the movement, like defund the police. Well, if you want to achieve something, anyone who wants to be an activist, you have to ask yourself, how can I formulate my proposals and demands and policies in a way which will lead to public understanding and support? Or shall I just formulate them to make me feel good and alienate people? That's a choice that happens all the time. Choice between feel-good tactics and do-good tactics. And in the case of Black Lives Matter, you saw both. The feel-good tactic, which was a major gift to President Trump and the far right, was just say, get rid of the police, get them out of our neighborhoods. Nobody's going to accept that, okay? It's just not in this universe, not in this world. Maybe you can imagine a different world, but not this one. There was actually a very sensible version of defund the police, which the main activists in Black Lives Matter formulated, which was pursued by people like Bernie Sanders openly and eloquently, and saying what defund the police means is take away from the police responsibilities which they should never have had. Like a large majority of police work is work that the police are not trained or equipped to do and don't want to do. Domestic disputes, mental health problems, lost dogs, whatever it may be. Take that away from the police, put it in the hands of community service. People can do it much better and don't have to walk around with guns and threatening people, okay? That'll already enormously defund the police, and the police are in favor of it. Then increase police salaries. So you're getting, it's a more desirable job. People will come in who have concerns other than just getting by, better training and so on. That's a policy of defund the police, which would be accepted by a lot of the police, maybe even favored by them, and accepted by the general community. Well, which one you pursue will determine whether your movement succeeds. And that's true of every social movement you can think of. I've been involved with dozens of them through my life, and the problem always comes up. Take, say, the Vietnam War protests. And by around 1970, the main protests were kind of breaking up into fracturing, like Students for the Democratic Society, one of the major groups, fractured. One group became Maoists, okay? They were going to stand outside the GE factory in Lynn with copies of a red book and hand it to the workers and say, let's have a revolution. Okay, you can guess how far that got. Friends of mine, incidentally, some of them Harvard professors, I should say. Then another group became the Weathermen. Let's break windows on Main Street and smash up the society. That'll bring a revolution, okay? The Vietnamese were appalled by this. I remember meetings with Vietnamese pleading with people to stop this. It's not helping them at all. It's harming them. It's just building up support for continuing the war. It just gets people angry, okay? Then they say, okay, let's destroy the bastards. And that's how the anti-war movement largely collapsed. This happens over and over. You pick the movement, look into it closely, you'll see these things developing. Well, those are the decisions you have to make if you want to be a serious organizer and activist. Things that may feel good don't matter. Nobody cares if you feel good. What matters if you do something that comes out with a constructive consequence. And there are plenty of things you can do. Serious organizers all know this, it's in their blood. That's the way you work. But if you kind of join the movement for excitement. You say, let's do something exciting. Let's break some windows. Let's shout Black Lives Matter in a suburban restaurant. Okay. You're just giving the opposition a great gift. Actually, one aspect of that is what's now called cancel culture. If I don't like some speaker and I don't want them on campus, I'll keep them off campus. Wonderful gift to the speaker who loves it and who can then present himself or herself as a great hero defending freedom against the gangsters. Wonderful gift to the right, has no effect on increasing understanding. The right way to respond is to say, okay, let the speaker come to campus. Let's organize a counter counter meetings or demonstrations in which we talk about the issues, expose what the person is up to, look into the real issues, figure out what we can do with them. You can turn it into an educational opportunity, a basis for activism, or you can turn it into a gift to the right. Okay, the kind of choice that people are facing all the time. And it's true of every activist movement I've ever had any contact with.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. We are now over time. Thank you for generously contributing your time to this. Thank you to the Section 5 committee and Joseph Shung for organizing. Do you have any last words that you think the HLS community needs to hear before we close the show?
Well, there's a very elementary message, which I've already mentioned, and I'll just repeat. Your generation is facing new questions which have never arisen. Basically, the question, will the human experiment persist in any recognizable form? And you're the first generation to face the question. You're the last generation to face it. Unless you answer it with a positive answer, which can be done, we're heading for disaster on many fronts. So you have an incredible responsibility, but a very exciting challenge. And I think you can't ignore that.
Professor Chomsky, it was a thrill and a privilege. Again, thank you for your time. This was an incredible opportunity for the whole lot of us. And thank you to the audience. And I guess that is a wrap.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.